Russian President Vladimir Putin has said that Russia had test-fired an intermediate-range missile last week from its arsenal designed to deliver nuclear weapons. But the critical fact about the testing of this IRBM was that it was not carrying nuclear warheads at the time that it exploded in the eastern Ukrainian city of Dnipro. The Russian strike did cause little damage, but it capped a dizzying week of tit-for-tat moves in the war in Ukraine. The focus of this war, which is going to close in on 3 years, has now shifted from ground assaults on the battlefield to a Cold War-style missile brinkmanship. In the last few days, Ukraine has fired longer-range missiles provided by America and Britain into military targets deep inside Russia. And Putin has made it clear that the Russian missile test was in response to those strikes as a sort of warning to the West to reconsider military aid for Kiev. On CRUX Decode, what is behind the military and missile brinkmanship by both Russia and Ukraine? Will it actually change anything on the ground? Or is the aim of both sides to try and increase their bargaining leverage ahead of Donald Trump taking office in January? The long-range missile duels have been going on jointly along with the fighting on the front lines. But here's the thing. These missile launches and counter-launches are having little discernible influence on the ground. Now, what this suggests is that the idea behind using these missiles, both for Ukraine and for Russia, serves a political purpose and not necessarily a military one. Ukraine is hoping for military gains that will provide leverage in any ceasefire negotiations. Moscow is also elevating the threat of nuclear war before President-elect Donald Trump is inaugurated in January. Trump, of course, has expressed skepticism about continuing American military support for Ukraine. He says he will end the war in 24 hours and he intends to broker a peace agreement to bring the war to an end. In fact, his vice president-elect, J.D. Vance, has said openly during the campaign that America should stop funding Ukraine. But there's also another catch, and that is to do with the limited availability of these high-end long-range rockets. Neither the US-provided missiles like the ATACMS or the British-made Storm Shadows are available in sufficient numbers for Ukraine to fire at Russia. Similarly, the experimental missile that Russia sent back is also not available in sufficient quantity to have a significant military effect. But Ukraine is still at a significant disadvantage on the battlefield. It is now being outmanned by forces of Russia, which are slowly inching up territory day after day, week after week, and the Ukrainian forces are slowly but surely retreating under these intense Russian assaults. Even with the new permission to strike deeper into Russian territory, Ukraine is rapidly approaching a point where if it does not address the manpower shortage issue, then it will struggle to defend the entire length of the Eastern Front. This was the assessment that was concluded by the Royal United Services Institute, which is an analytical group affiliated with the British military and which studied Ukraine's prospects. Without more soldiers, the Institute study said that the collapse in fighting positions will only accelerate. In response to the Russian missile test, speaking last weekend, Ukraine's President Vladimir Zelensky said that Putin had timed last week's strike ahead of the coming US presidential inauguration. Russia's goal, he said, is to expel Ukraine from a pocket of territory that it holds of Russia before Trump takes office. The new missiles were part of this Russian plan. In Ukraine, the fear is that Russia will seek to escalate in anticipation of talks, pursuing a strategy of placing as many threats as possible on the table before negotiating to take them away. Putin's actions are aimed not at today or tomorrow, but they are aimed at January 20th when Trump becomes president. Hence, Putin's lowering of the nuclear threshold in response to the US and UK providing Ukraine with long-range rockets. Throughout the last few months, North Korean soldiers have begun arriving in Russia, and the US and Ukrainian officials say there are about 10,000 of these North Korean troops who have joined or intend to join Russian forces in the southern region of Kursk. Ukraine had seized parts of Kursk back in August in the hope that Kursk can be used as a bargaining tool as and when negotiations begin. Russia, too, has been facing a personnel shortage, which it has been trying to make up with North Korean troops and increasingly now Yemeni soldiers. The aim is to expel Ukraine from the territory that it seized. Western countries have been saying that bringing in combat troops from a third country represents an escalation by Moscow. They have cited that as justification for allowing Ukraine to use a type of American ballistic missile called the ATACMS, which are then used to fire deep into Russian territory. But the agreement is limited to that area in which North Korean troops have been deployed. The UK too quickly followed suit with permissions to fire its Storm Shadow cruise missiles into Russia. Russia responded by formalizing a new nuclear doctrine which lowered the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons, and then of course it responded with the missile test of the intermediate range ballistic missile. The Pentagon described that missile as based on a decade-old Russian design called the RS-26 or the Rubezh. But Putin said it was a new experimental design called Oreshnik. Late last week, Ukraine's military intelligence agency, the HUR, offered details of the weapon that Russia tested. It flew in about 11 times the speed of sound, and before impact, it released 6 warheads, which broke into 36 different smaller ammunitions. Its flight from the Astrakhan region of Russia into Dnipro was about 15 minutes. The weapon also had one ability which is associated primarily with nuclear-armed missiles, which is the ability to release multiple smaller warheads, the effect which lit up the early morning sky in Dnipro. The American missiles which Ukraine was allowed to use to launch into Russia will have limited impact. They have, so far at least, forced Russia to move some of their fighter planes from airfields close to the border. That could help stymie Russia's offensive into the Kursk. But Ukraine has too few ATACMS to significantly harm Russia's military logistics close to the border. And Ukraine has no choice but to continue the ground fighting despite the latest threat of nuclear war implied by Russian missile launch. Ukraine will not be able to alter how it has been fighting this war, at least for the foreseeable future.